So part of what I was looking for were things to explore with regard to Warne that I think perhaps had not fully been focused on or articulated. And I mentioned one of those earlier, this affinity with and connection to England and Englishness that, the Bristol Club cricket in 89, the Lancashire League in 91, not just as preparation for 93, not just as sort of learning conditions, but as a sort of more obscure, almost kind of spiritual connection with England. And he talked about this through kind of his later career and after retirement of having a real affinity for England as well. And that's curious. We thought this sort of arch nemesis of English cricket was also a figure who had a real kind of affinity for England as well, and a real fondness for England. So I guess part of it was also trying to kind of work out ways of, or angles with which to approach Shane Warne and his career in a manner that wasn't retreading some of the things that have already been written about with regard to his career and his life.
Hello, I'm Zeb Baker-Smith, editor at Aspects of History. One unforgettable delivery, a genius athlete, and a defining figure for many. But still, the most teasing historical question remains. Can single moments and instances shape eras? This week on the podcast, I'm joined by author Brendan Cooper to discuss his new book, Ball of the Century, a remarkable exploration of Shane Warne's iconic first Ashes delivery at Old Trafford on the 4th of June 1993. He traces the story of the Australian leg spinner's rise, the psychological hold he exerted over English cricket, and the wider cultural landscape of Britain during the 90s. We discuss how sporting mythology, memory, and the enduring power of Ashes folklore combine to transcend the boundaries of sport and transform Warne into a cultural icon. Next week on the podcast, historian and author Gautam Hazarika discusses the forgotten Indian prisoners of World War II with Phil Craig, as well as Subhas Chandra Bose and the Indian National Army. But for now, take a moment and reminisce about the Ball of the Century with Brendan Cooper. Brendan, great to have you on during an already eventful cricketing summer, and thanks for joining me on the Aspects of History podcast.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, the new book, Ball of the Century, takes a single moment, Shane Warne's famous delivery at Old Trafford on the 4th of June 93, and turns it into a history of an era, a cultural record of the 90s, a biography of the legend himself, and more. When did you first believe that one ball, a single moment, could sustain an entire book? Or was this in the same way you so kind of brilliantly described the delivery itself, the iceberg on the horizon of your literary career, waiting in the deep to be encountered?
Well, I guess a couple of things to say. One is that I think it's such a uniquely iconic moment in cricketing history, and that there hadn't been a book that sort of focused on it as arguably the most famous moment in the history of cricket, and a moment of such sort of seismic significance for a number of different reasons, including this kind of the effect that it had on English cricket. But I guess the second thing to say is that the book, although the delivery itself is at the heart of the book is about a number of different things at the same time. It's about Ashes cricket in the 90s. It's about English cricket in the 90s. It's about Britain in the 90s too, and trying to sort of place all of this cricketing action in a sort of cultural context. It's to some extent about Shane Warne, of course. It's also about to a degree, Mike Gatting as the sort of victim of this particular situation. And so it sort of weaves together a number of different threads in the story that I tell.
Yeah, so for those of you listeners who remember watching it live, I assume it's a good few, this image of a kind of peroxide blonde Aussie hurrying up to the wicket, the drift, the off stump going, it's become a kind of touchstone of his genius and mythologized. A part of me feels I've always kind of known it in the 20 years or so I've been following cricket. I think it's a bit of a received memory. But do you think those involved at the game, kind of at the ground watching, were aware of how significant a moment it was and how it changed cricket? Or was that does that significance kind of grow in the retelling? Is it changing even now?
It's a very good and in some ways quite a complicated question. I think so. Speaking to someone like Mike Atherton, as I did for this book, he was quite keen to some extent, sort of downplay the immediacy of this sort of seismic significance of that particular delivery. It wasn't the case, he said, that immediately kind of all the England team in the dressing room were kind of collapsing in some kind of paroxysm of sort of futility or anything like that. And I do sort of explore this question of, okay, to what extent has perhaps the ball of the century been steadily mythologized, increasingly mythologized over the years? And I think there's always an element of that with any sort of significant moment in sport or anything else. But I also was at pains to point out that in the British press in particular, straight away, there was a great deal of emphasis on this really is a moment of profound significance and disastrous significance for England. There was a sense of the kind of not just the technical but the psychological consequences of that particular delivery that was immediately kind of seized upon. There was a sense that this is something special. This is something really quite extraordinary, this moment. In part, perhaps because it announced so abruptly the arrival of an extraordinary bowler on the international scene, who, the English public and English team didn't know a lot about before that point, although Warne had a degree of success in the months prior to coming to England that summer. But also just the kind of otherworldly brilliance of that moment as something which, kind of stood out against perhaps the kind of sort of the everyday reality of cricketing history. So I think there is evidence looking back to 93, looking back at the kind of press response, that there was something kind of in the air, some recognition. That certainly was my experience too, I should say, as a sort of 13-year-old watching that summer, that Ashes obsessively. That I remember very vividly feeling like as soon as Warne was brought on to bowl, after that point, that's it. It's all over. We have no chance. That this kind of unstoppable hydrogen bomb of cricketing superiority was just being launched at us, and that there was no chance. As soon as he started bowling, then we would just kind of collapse in a heap. So certainly that's what I felt as a sort of 13-year-old cricketing fan that summer, and I think that there will have been a widespread feeling along those lines as a result of how everything kind of panned out.
Yeah, it's so interesting, those memories that stick with you at that age. Talk us through Shane Warne's journey himself up to that point. That was the kind of first ball he'd ever bowled in Ashes cricket, and just 2 years before he'd been playing as the Accrington CC pro down the road. How aware were the English in advance of the asteroid that was about to strike them? Did he emerge from nowhere?
So, technically, he certainly didn't emerge from nowhere. In particular, in the months before coming to England, he'd had some really quite significant success against the West Indies. He got a 7-wicket haul, including a kind of what became quite a famous flipper to Richie Richardson. He got a lot of wickets against New Zealand as well. Those are the final tests that Australia played just before coming to England. And so he was shaping up to be a sort of world-class performer. But what England knew was very little. And I think it's important to emphasize that this was a time before the arrival of technical analysis. And technology wasn't really being used in the manner that it would be now. If the same equivalent thing was happening now, then England would be studying all of that footage. They would know all about not just who Warne was, but exactly the kind of bowler that he was, exactly how technically he might be countered, that kind of thing. But that hadn't happened. His name will have been floating around in quite a vague sense as, okay, they've got this young leg spinner. Turns it quite a lot, people say, but it was word of mouth, so Graham Gooch was someone who kind of emphasized this quite clearly when I spoke to him about the 93 Ashes. They'd heard of Warne, but word of mouth was how things were passed on rather than through things like the kind of video analysis that obviously now is a kind of foundational principle of that sort of preparation. So, he I mean, that in terms of England's awareness, it was pretty limited. That he was this sort of unfamiliar blur of blonde highlights at the end of his run-up, and there wasn't a lot known about him. You mentioned something else, though, which is the fact that 2 years earlier, he had been the cricketing pro for Accrington in the Lancashire Leagues. He also, 2 years before that, came to England to play club cricket for Imperial Cricket Club in Bristol. And I think, and again, I talk about this in some detail in the book, that those formative experiences in a number of different ways were really, really significant for Warne. And one of the things they led to is that as a sort of 23-year-old about to bowl his first ball in Ashes cricket, he wasn't at all unfamiliar with English cricketing conditions and pitches and that, cement-coloured sky of Manchester above him on the 4th of June, 1993. He knew all about it. He'd been playing for Lancashire 2 years earlier and had played through a whole season of that. The Accrington ground was only 25 minutes away from Old Trafford. So those links to England prior to 1993 actually, I think, were really important in a number of different ways.
And you tell those episodes at his big nights out and the clubs of Bristol so well. There is this kind of argument in the book that English cricket spent much of the 1990s kind of living in the shadow of that moment. Why did he become such a uniquely difficult opponent and kind of beyond his extraordinary talent and sustained Australian supremacy during that era? Why?
So I think one thing to say with regard to England having to face Warne is there weren't really, leg spin was quite alien to English cricket in the late 80s, early 90s. We had one conspicuous leg spin bowler in Ian Salisbury, who had quite a patchy career, in and out of the side at different times, not a successful England career. England weren't facing much leg spin. In fact, leg spin was a rare phenomenon, in many ways, kind of across the globe at this point, and it was a sort of dying art. But certainly in English cricket, England were ill-equipped to face someone like Warne. He was antithetical in some ways to the sort of classical English spinner, finger spinner, perhaps not turning it very much, accurate, keeping runs down, keeping things tight, picked perhaps for their batting ability as well. That was the kind of conservative-minded philosophy around a lot of sort of English spin bowling selection. And so this kind of exotic, otherworldly figure who turned the ball 2 feet was not just a really good bowler, but was a bowler that was kind of beyond the parameters of English cricketing thinking, a sort of transcendent figure in that sense as well. So there's that. And then there's, I guess, things that you could look at a technical level about what made Warne so unique. He had a capacity, put it simply, to bowl wrist spin, a notoriously difficult skill. It's the most difficult skill in cricket, it's often said, with a level of accuracy that you can say was probably never seen before in cricket. So he would turn the ball extravagantly, but he could be very accurate as well. That accuracy was something that generally would be sacrificed with a wrist spinner. You wouldn't be so accurate, but you might be kind of damaging. Well, Warne was able to be accurate and disruptive by turning the ball a very long way. So those are a couple of things, but I guess I'd add to that the kind of psychological dimension to the whole thing. And we can talk about this more perhaps, but that for English cricket, and I think perhaps for sort of cricketing opponents across the world, there was a sense of psychological domination, a sense of kind of Warne having a psychological hold on the opposition. By the time we got to the 94-95 Ashes, there was lots of this in the press, the idea that it wasn't just the technical challenge of facing Shane Warne as a really good bowler. There was the kind of psychological difficulty of dealing with this figure who we knew to be so superior, and also was already kind of evolving a real mastery of the psychological element of being out there on the cricketing stage and dominating opponents and sort of psyching them out, whether it's with sledging or whether it's other aspects of the kind of the performative and psychological element of things. So I think as the 90s went on, that was something else that Warne was a kind of a real master at, on top of the technical difficulty of actually how do you play this guy.
Yeah, I mean, so many of the points you pick up on there. The idea that leg spin was this dying art. I mean, my first day of Test cricket was the first day of the Oval in 2005, where he's brought on after 10 overs and then takes 5 in the day. Yeah. And, at that point, I never realized that leg spin was this kind of extinct dinosaur kind of art form, 12 years before. So yeah, it is an astonishing sea change, but you're particularly thoughtful in your kind of exploration of spin bowling and dissecting the kind of semantics and the kind of upheld attributes throughout the book. But yeah, give us a flavor of some of those findings.
I think saying that leg spin was dead is, I guess, technically not quite correct. And it never was quite dead in the early 90s or late 80s. Abdul Qadir in the 1980s almost sort of single-handedly kept leg spin alive to a Pakistan leg spin bowler, a world-class operator in many ways and a real inspiration for Shane Warne, actually. And there were a couple of other figures in the sort of first half of the 90s. Mushtaq Ahmed also for Pakistan, who was a kind of protege of Abdul Qadir and modelled himself on Qadir. India had Anil Kumble, a very, very eccentric sort of wrist spin bowler who didn't really turn the ball much at all, but relied on sort of bounce and flight and pace variations. It was a very unusual, sort of unique spin bowling operator. So there were these individual figures around, but I think kind of when Warne came on the scene, it's worth saying that in the Ashes series prior to 93, so the 1990 to 91 in Australia, that was a series where Australia didn't really use a sort of full a frontline spin bowler at all. They had some frontline spin bowlers, so Peter Taylor, Tim May, Trevor Holmes, a few others, but they didn't pick them. They picked Greg Matthews, an all-rounder who bowled some off spin as well, some slightly pedestrian off spin. So that's a sign, I think, that Australia didn't see spin bowling at that point as kind of at the forefront of what they wanted to offer or what they felt was the kind of core of their own cricketing activity. So that's the kind of hole that Shane Warne came into. It wasn't just in English cricket, but there was a sense perhaps that Warne was sort of filling a gap, a void in top quality leg spin. I think before Warne came along, it was in some ways seen as a sort of to a degree an impossible art. Going back to the point about accuracy, that leg spin, you couldn't bowl it accurately. It was too difficult. It was always going to be a risk to bowl a leg spinner. The idea of a sort of perfected version of leg spin is something that felt unavailable. It felt like a dream rather than a reality. And one of the things you could say happened is that Warne came along and demonstrated that perfected version of leg spin. Here it was in real life, perhaps in a manner that people didn't really expect to be able to see.
Yeah, I mean, you almost see it with the reticence to play Rehan Ahmed today as well, and that kind of lack of control he's kind of almost been branded with.
And also just on that lack of trust of wrist spinners, it was there in the 90s, and even someone like I'd mentioned Mushtaq Ahmed, who was a really, really kind of very, very strong, talented, destructive bowler, was sort of in and out of the side. To some extent, was at times sort of dropped in favour of finger spinners like Saqlain Mushtaq, for example. So there's a sort of long history of leg spinners not being fully trusted. Ian Salisbury, as I mentioned, was England's leg spinner and was only occasionally picked, and there was generally a sense that they weren't reliable enough to be playing at the top level.
Hello, Zeb here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben McIntyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show. And then kind of zooming in into, as you said, the kind of cultural account you give. Why the 90s? And, you know, this book demonstrates a period of enormous change, kind of cricket, but also broadly socially across the... do you think that the fortunes of the team kind of reflect the mood and culture of the decade, or is it a useful exercise to consider kind of reciprocity between sporting and...
I feel like it is, and that is part of the kind of philosophy behind the book. You know, that old sort of C.L.R. James line of, you know, what do they know of cricket that only cricket know? This sense that there is and that there has to be some connectedness of some sort, which might be elusive and which might be complicated, between the nature of things that are happening on a cricket pitch and perhaps the nature of what's happening elsewhere. And the book starts, the first main chapter is on Mike Gatting and the final Rebel tour to South Africa that he captained in 1990. And one of the things I talk about there is that he clearly was trying to adopt a philosophy of saying, look, we're just cricketers. We're nothing to do with the political activity or controversy of South Africa. We're just going to turn up and play cricket. And that one of the things he sort of realised as the disastrous tour unfolded is that you can't do that you can't sort of disconnect sporting action from the cultural and political context in which it's happening. And lo and behold, you know, the tour, which was disastrous at sort of every level, really was abandoned early, and they came home in disgrace. And so I talk about that quite a lot, and I do quite a lot through the book of sort of weaving back and forth between the cricketing action in the 90s and various aspects of the kind of cultural context, political context, sort of pop culture, music of the time, just trying to perhaps also just take people back to that time and create a feeling of the mood and the atmosphere of the 90s in a broader sense by talking through perhaps some of those kind of influential or iconic kind of aspects of what was happening culturally, as well as focusing on the cricket.
So Warne, who died of a heart attack in 2022, he was evidently this larger-than-life character, both on and off the field. I mean, not only was his death a kind of I remember where I was moment, but it does add to the poignancy of the book and this kind of maybe sensation of a better time and a kind of glorified era of real characters. But how hard is it to separate the kind of anecdotes and the fables, the legend from the cricketer and the human being when writing the book? What do you think his kind of great legacy is?
I mean, a number of things to say. I mean, I do talk quite a lot about the aspects of Warne that were sort of beyond him just being a cricketer, in terms of sort of quite sort of elusive stuff to do with just a charismatic energy, and that being an important part of actually what was happening on the pitch, that there was this intimidating quality to his presence, that there was this sort of charisma, that there was this kind of sense, say, certainly from an English perspective, that you were not just playing against a kind of very good bowler, but that you were playing against a kind of legend, a cultural legend, and that deepened the challenge of having to kind of face him. So that's something that I talk about and explore in the book. I guess I also was, although I allude to sort of some of the kind of personal life controversies that affected him and that he had to deal with as the pressure of fame arrived, I didn't want this to be, you know, a kind of scurrilous book that focused. There's a lot to say about the personal life of Warne. I wanted to centralise the cricketing life of Warne, and so I sort of make some of those connections where it felt in some way relevant to the kind of cricketing story that I was trying to tell.
Obviously, it's a game that's kind of fixated on history and narrative and memory. And why do these certain moments, you know, Headingley, 1981, 2019, this particular one? Why do they become part of a collective consciousness, is in a way that kind of others might not? There will be summers that I remember far more than summers I don't in terms of cricket, but what do they have in common? Is there a kind of, is it personalities, is it shock of the new, is there a kind of DNA to these occasions?
That's a very good, I think, quite complicated question. I think one thing is, it's not a coincidence that you mentioned those, sort of Headingley 81, Old Trafford 93, Headingley 2019. They're all Ashes moments. So part of the answer, I think, is the kind of uniquely elevated cultural significance for us of Ashes cricket, and that there are lots of other kind of extraordinary cricketing moments that have happened in England that are well known to cricket fans, but that haven't quite transcended the sport to the same degree. And so there's something about the Ashes. There's something about the Ashes as kind of at the spiritual core, if you like, of English cricketing thought and feeling. That means that when an extraordinary moment happens, whether it's Botham's innings or Warne's ball of the century or Ben Stokes in 2019, that it lifts it beyond cricket itself to some other level of cultural significance. I think that's part of the answer, and perhaps part of the answer is also a kind of a feeling of an encounter with the impossible. Perhaps something that all of those three moments share. Botham playing that innings in 81 and England winning a test match from what looks literally really like a sort of impossible position. Ben Stokes playing an impossible innings, achieving a sort of impossible victory in 2019. And then Shane Warne bowling what appears to be an impossible delivery, the sort of the immediate shock of this delivery coming from nowhere, and looking like something, from a sort of another planet. So perhaps that's also part of the answer.
Your previous books have kind of explored more kind of cultural chronology and philosophical aspects of kind of cricket and snooker. So, I mean, do you regard this as a kind of demonstration in how small moments can reshape, periods of time, decades, eras even? Or is it merely a cricket book?
Hopefully not merely a cricket book. I think going back to some of those points about, trying to kind of embed the cricket in a sort of broader cultural journey through the 90s. And I think, that question is one of the central questions of the book. Can a single moment shape history? Is that really what happened on the 4th of June, 1993, just after 3:00 in the afternoon? Is this just a famous moment in cricket, or is it in some way a kind of profound sea change in cricketing history? And I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it is that it is something more than just a kind of famous moment or a great delivery. But it was a number of other things as well. It was, the announced arrival of this extraordinary, unique cricketing genius, who, from that moment, the legend of Warne kind of unveiled itself to cricket fans across the world. But it was also a moment of kind of ruination for English cricket. This sort of expression, this perfect expression of the futility of even attempting to compete against Australia. And so it also was the kind of this hinge point where we were sort of staring into disaster, staring into a kind of inevitable failure. And a lot of Ashes cricket in the 90s had that sense of futility. It had that sense of a kind of inevitability when things were kind of crumbling. That, well, of course, because there's no way we can compete. There's no way we can compete against this kind of fundamentally superior cricketing team, at the core of which was Warne. And for the reasons I've kind of said, I think that Warne almost seemed to be a kind of embodiment of everything that English cricket could only ever dream of.
I mean, the English game lost a hero this week that we're recording in Ben Stokes. I mean, another kind of extraordinary, yet extraordinarily difficult character to pin down. Not quite the same league in my book, but do you think a player today can kind of stand tall in the global ecosystem in the same way that Warne can, or kind of would you have a moment of utter shock and awe in a world where, you know, we can see some mystery leg spinner bamboozling batsman in the Tamil Nadu Premier League on somebody's phone? Is that possible now?
I would never say that it's impossible. You know, these kind of transcendent figures do seem to reappear and recur through the history of every sport, and perhaps you're just at the point where you think you might be kind of looking for the next one, and someone will emerge. And so, I guess you can talk about the uniqueness of Warne and this very kind of unique combination of qualities that he had, in not just technically, but also in terms of his sort of persona and personality. But I think you can also I expect to see transcendence, expect to see a kind of brilliance within whatever the kind of sporting context is. And, you know, to some extent, as you say, I think not to the extent that Warne had it, but to some extent, Ben Stokes was capable of that. He wasn't capable of it consistently. But there was always the volcanic possibility of impossible feats. And there are very few cricketers who I think have had that about them, have had that sense of, or something kind of genuinely extraordinary could emerge from this person. And so, as you say, I think in Ben Stokes we've lost a rare figure, in the sense that he certainly was capable of the impossible at times.
Yeah, I mean, you start your previous book, Echoing Greens, with that great kind of diptych of W.G. Grace and Ian Botham, and I wonder maybe there's a triptych in another edition, but complicated people.
Yeah, and something else that kind of I've written about before is the sort of the connection between genius and volatility, which is something you can think about with regard to Warne. You can think about it with regard to Stokes. You can, again, going back to this question of, you know, those sporting figures who are sort of volcanically capable of the impossible. There tends to be a certain degree of kind of volatility or instability about those figures. The idea that sort of genius in some way requires an element of volatility in order fully to express itself, that there's some connection between the unpredictability or unevenness or inconsistency of a certain figure and their capacity to do something which is truly transcendent. And so that's something else, I think, you know, perhaps, you know, you look at kind of Warne's career and the sort of the ebb and flow of it and the ups and downs and some of the things I talk about, the low points there, which in some kind of intriguing sense, we might say are kind of intrinsically connected to the extraordinary highs that he was also capable of.
Scraps in nightclubs might be the way to resurrect my career. You contemplate sport in a really novel way, but I kind of wanted to ask, who are your kind of cricket writing heroes and the examples you kind of look up to and look to when kind of endeavouring to bring a book together?
I guess there's a lot to say on that front. We mentioned C.L.R. James earlier, and I think one of the great sort of things about Beyond the Boundary is that it's a cricket book, but it's also not a cricket book. It's also about kind of quite sort of significant and profound cultural and philosophical questions. And so that, I guess, is that's one of the things that inspires aspects of my writing, going back to things we were talking about earlier. There are lots of, I think, very good cricket writers around, from, you know, Duncan Hamilton and his books on cricket, and again a sort of a wonderfully warm philosophical kind of dinner table quality feel that his sort of reminiscences and reflections have a kind of real warmth as well as an eloquence to them. Gideon Haigh is Gideon Haigh on Warne, I think is you know, there is a sort of book, quite a short book on Warne that he wrote that I think is one of the best analytical investigations into Warne as a bowler and as a cricketing figure. So those are certainly some names who I would say. John Houghton is another writer I think is a very, very eloquent and witty and entertaining cricket writer. Different writers in different ways.
If somebody in their teens, say, had picked up this book and had never seen Shane Warne bowl, what do you kind of hope they would garner from him from cricket itself in the 90s after reading Ball of the Century? What would be the big takeaway for those who might not have the pangs for 90s cricket?
You're writing, I guess, so you're always writing for different audiences. And one audience is, an audience who remembers the 90s, who remembers the cricket that I'm writing about or half remembers. And so there's that sort of sense, okay, let's sort of take those readers on a kind of reminiscence, a sort of nostalgic journey through the 90s. But for younger readers who don't remember that time, I guess it's an introduction both to the kind of Ashes cricket in the 90s and also aspects, I think, of what in particular sort of British culture felt like in the 90s and just sort of that journey, that sort of cultural and political as well as cricketing journey. With regard to Warne, I think I was aware that, I'm talking about aspects of Warne's life and career. Warne has been written about quite a lot. So part of what I was looking for were things to explore with regard to Warne that I think perhaps had not fully been focused on or articulated. And I mentioned one of those earlier, this affinity with and connection to England and Englishness that, the Bristol Club cricket in 89, the Lancashire League in 91, not just as preparation for 93, not just as sort of learning conditions, but as a sort of more obscure, almost kind of spiritual connection with England. And he talked about this through kind of his later career and after retirement of having a real affinity for England as well. And that's curious when you thought this sort of arch nemesis of English cricket was also a figure who had a real kind of affinity for England as well and a real fondness for England. So I guess part of it was also trying to kind of work out ways of or angles with which to approach Shane Warne and his career in a manner that wasn't retreading some of the things that have already been written about with regard to his career and his life.
Yeah, the epilogue was a bit of a tearjerker for me this morning, and not for the kind of reasons you might think. Will you be sticking with cricket or returning to snooker? What's next in terms of projects, possible future titles we might expect?
There's not a clear answer to that question at the moment. I'm sort of between, there are a few things sort of knocking around, but they're kind of quite sort of nebulous and obscure and not really kind of articulable in my mind. Some of which to do with sport, some of which to do with other territories. So I think one of the things that the coming months will require is for me just to kind of work out which of those embryonic ideas feels like it's sort of there at the foreground for further exploration. But at the moment, I'm still just between the energies of from one project to the next.
We look forward to hearing the outcome. Thanks again, Brendan. Fantastic you could join me to talk us through and deep dive this kind of fabled moment in time, the great man himself, and the kind of mystical arts of leg spin and cricket writing. So Ball of the Century is published, out now in hardback by Constable. Listeners, have a look in the podcast notes for the links to purchase it. Thank you, Brendan. Another time, I hope.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes. Please share with friends and family and keep your eyes peeled for new episodes. And if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.